Modern European states really almost unanimously formed through processes of international war and civil war. If you look through the national narratives of virtually any state, and key episodes within it will be those of armed conflict, again, domestic or international. This is true, of course, of post-colonial states as well, who attained independence through generally some form of armed struggle. So when we think about the effect of war on human history, one of the ways we might perhaps approach it is as a selection process. That over the course of history, war allowed certain states to thrive and to enlarge, and others to the presence of political communities in early modern Europe. And we look at the trend, one that comes out very clearly is the progressive disappearance of large numbers of alternative political communities and the concentration of political power through conquest and annexation within a relatively few number of states. So in the 14th century, if we surveyed Europe, we would find around 1,000 separate political entities. By 1500, this had been halved to about 500. By 1789, on the dawn of the French Revolution, there were 350 political entities remaining. And by 1900, beginning of the 20th century, a mere 25 had remained. So a formidable concentration of power and territory taking place over the course of 500 years or so. One of the ways to understand this process is through the changes that occurred in the conduct of war itself, and particularly what historians have referred to as the military revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. So what we find in this period is a marked intensification of war and an increasing scale of the armies that are used to combat these wars. According to historians, between 1530 and 1710, the size of armies increased by a factor of 10. So much larger armies are put in the field on a size that hadn't been seen since the ancient world. Alongside this is a series of technological and tactical developments. The advent of gunpowder plays firstly a predominant role in the development of artillery and subsequently firearms. The decline of cavalry had been the dominant military unit throughout most of the Middle Ages. This gives rise to, this decline occurs in favor of infantry. And we see also in this period the development of new techniques of fortification, which are themselves often a response to the development of gunpowder, defense in depth fortifications that extend themselves backwards, since conventional medieval walls are too easily breached by artillery. Later, of course, we see the industrialization of war, which leads to a rapid technological turnover of weapons and a further intensification of conflict. And of course, we still live in a world where this technological turnover is particularly intense. What we see throughout this period, the increase of armies, the new technological basis for war, all of these require increasing resources. In other words, war becomes an increasingly expensive business. And to pursue this, an economic analogy, what we are really seeing is rising economies of scale. In other words, you need to invest significant amounts in order to be competitive in a marketplace of violence. You need to be able to raise armies of a certain size, which is extremely costly. You need to be able to construct weapons and complex defensive structures that itself requires large amounts of resources. So what this means is these rising economies of scale make smaller political entities less viable. In the early modern period, what we'd often seen is actually quite small political entities be dominant. The small states of, or small city-states of the Italian peninsula, the prosperous trading states of the Netherlands, or the Low Countries. These had successfully gained prominence through their use of naval power and their reliance on mercenary forces. But mercenary forces became eventually too expensive when they had to compete against very large landed armies. So that the new emerging great powers of France or Prussia were able to assemble professional armies on the basis of an enlarged tax basis, and that no longer that would outstrip the numbers of mercenaries that even the most prosperous small states could put in the field. So we see a shift away towards the larger states, which is one of the ways to explain the concentration of power and territory. Similarly, in this period, we see the progressive weakening and marginalization of another type of political actor that had previously been a dominant one in warfare. I'm talking here about the nomadic societies, the Huns of the 4th and 5th century, the Mongols of the 13th century. These had typically been far better warrior societies than the sedentaries. The nomads were generally involved in a predatory relationship with the sedentaries. What occurs in this period is that the sedentaries gain the upper hand because of the transformation of the means of war. You can't build artillery and advanced fortifications on with a nomadic basis. You need infrastructures, production, eventually industrial infrastructures. All of this is, of course, precluded to nomadic societies. So, of course, nomadic warriors become some of the biggest losers of history in this period. As I've already stated, with the rise of the absolutist state, what we see is mercenary armies giving way to professional standing armies by the beginning of the 18th century, and subsequently to the mass conscription armies of the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a paradox here, perhaps, that's observed by the historian Charles Tilly, which says we might perhaps expect that at a time where capitalism and monetization develop, we might expect perhaps a persistence of private armies. That, after all, violence might be just another service or good to be purchased in the marketplace. But again, there are reasons why conscripted armies are preferred to mercenary armies. Quite simply, conscripted armies are much cheaper, more dedicated, and reliable than mercenaries. Mercenaries fight for their immediate income. They don't fight for a cause or for a state's glory. Moreover, mercenary armies pose huge problems in terms of domestic order and the monopolization of violence, because the control that a state can exert over a mercenary army is much less. It was a recurrent problem was mercenary armies who were behaving badly, particularly if they hadn't been paid. They were likely to turn to mutiny and local pillaging. So in the context of a process of the monopoly of violence, it of course makes a lot of sense for states to move towards conscripted or professional armies in this period. One of the other consequences of this move to professional or conscripted armies is the growth of state bureaucracy. States increasingly have to manage these larger armed forces, deal with policies of recruitment, training, pensions, and so forth. And so one of the drivers of bureaucracy in this period is the army itself. This is something that Max Weber recognized well enough when he explains to us that the bureaucratic tendency has chiefly been influenced by needs arising from the creation of standing armies, as determined by power politics and by the development of public finance connected with the military establishment. So, as I've said to you before, the state is closely associated with the bureaucratic form. And the bureaucratic form, of course, is essential to the state for a variety of reasons, not least the pursuit of tax collection, but also all the various functions of the state as it becomes more and more involved in the running of its societies. But it is important to recognize that the military aspect of the state is one of the earliest drivers of bureaucracy, and would continue to be so as war became increasingly intense and total. Furthermore, Bruce Porter notes that war has a multiplicity of formative effects on the state. So there are a number of aspects of the warring experience that are conducive to the emergence or to the strengthening of states. For example, wars are unifying and rallying. In a state of war, it's easier to call for national unity, for gathering around the flag. War has also a centralizing effect. The state can more easily concentrate power in the condition of war, where the urgency of the war will sweep some of the resistances and objections to further concentration. As I've already stated, war has it drives bureaucratization itself and government growth more generally. Notably, states are able to raise taxes. In the case of a war, raising taxes is generally not met with major objections, at least at the outset. And to all this, Porter adds that we see a ratchet effect, which is to say that increases in government taxes, bureaucratization, and so forth that occur in the condition of war never recede completely when the war ends. So some of the intensity of central and bureaucratic and control and tax levels may recede somewhat, but never fully to where it was before, so that every war sees an incremental increase in state power. Finally, Porter observes that wars offer opportunities for leadership, for particular individuals to stand out as war leaders and eventually state makers. And once again, we only need to summarily cast our minds to national narratives and think about how powerfully and strongly certain key figures stand within these narratives, and how most of the time these figures have some role to play in war. They are often war leaders or leaders of the state in conditions of armed conflict.